I think it's clear that the Clash Royale dev team's card development style has changed over time, transitioning from simple to more complex mechanics. And it's fair enough. If they kept releasing cards with simple mechanics and nothing unique, they would always be criticized by the player base for being lazy. However, this got me thinking, what would old cards look like if they were released today? That's why in this video, I've gathered some OG Clash Royale cards to brainstorm some possible ideas on what the modern dev team would do with these cards. The Miner is one of the most versatile cards in the game, with arguably one of the most complex mechanics for a troop, where he kind of acts like a spell and a troop at the same time, but not in the same way as a royal delivery. If Clash Royale were to release the Miner in modern day Clash Royale, I feel like it wouldn't be very different to what we have currently in terms of his mechanics. It's a great concept that perfectly aligns with the type of innovation that the modern Clash Royale dev team has. However, in terms of his stats, I feel like he would be pretty different. Firstly, I think Clash Royale would quote-unquote accidentally make it so that he doesn't have a crown tower damage stat on release, and make it so that his damage is the same regardless of all the troops that he hits, or they would make it so that his crown tower damage is so high that it would basically be the same as his normal damage. The reason I think this is because Clash Royale somehow let the Goblin Machine and the Goblinstein ability do full damage to towers rather than have a crown tower damage stat when these cards first came out, so it's not out of the question. And it would also sort of align with the fact that cards always seem to be insanely overpowered when they're first released. I also feel like Clash Royale would make it the only troop that can be only placed on the offensive side, since I feel like they would want to make it a purely offensive card, since that's what a lot of modern day Clash Royale card releases have been like. Okay, while editing, I had a bit of a different idea here. Rather than making it so that it can only be placed on the offensive side, I think it may be better if they gave him a lower damage multiplier if he is placed on the defensive side rather than the offensive side, so that you are not directly punished to play him on defense, which would still make him versatile but not a no-skill card. So overall, I think the Miner is one of the only cards that would have the same mechanics if it was released today compared to back in 2016. I think that the Barbarian Hut wouldn't get released into Clash Royale if it was made today. If all other spawner buildings were added to Clash Royale and the Barb Hut wasn't released, then Clash Royale would learn that spawner buildings are some of the most unbalanced cards in the game, and therefore not even dare to make a Barb Hut in fear of it either flopping when released and therefore not being worth it for them to invest their time into, or being so overpowered that it creates a toxic meta. But since I feel like that would make for a pretty boring video, I think that in the unlikely instance that they were to release the Barbarian Hut, they would probably release it alongside an evolution so that the card can be balanced out by its evolution. I feel like they would make the card 5 Elixir but spawn less Barbarians, since this would make it better competition to other spawner buildings like the Tombstone. I feel like the Expo is such a simple card that it wouldn't be an exciting card release if it was just released as a 6 Elixir fast attacking siege building. Okay, just a note here, I have no clue what I meant with this first line here. I actually think that it would be an amazing card release if it was made today, since it would literally be one of the only cards in its class, much like the Mortar. I think what I meant here is that if the Mortar was already in the game, then it might make the Expo look like just another siege building. But even then, the Expo is so different to the Mortar, I really don't know where I was going with this first line. Okay, back to the video. I feel like Clash Royale would probably give it a similar mechanic to the Spirit Empress, or give it an entirely new mechanic such as card versions. For example, they would probably make it so that you can choose between a Ground Expo and an Air Expo, like the one from Clash of Clans, where the Ground Expo would have the range that the current Expo has, or an Air Expo that has a smaller range but can target air troops. In fact, Clash Royale did used to have an air targeting Expo, but it was linked to the base card, so it's definitely not something that's out of the question. If the Expo were to get the same mechanics as the Spirit Empress, it would probably be a thing where you can choose its range and health depending on the amount of Elixir you want to play, where 6 Elixir would be the normal Expo that we have today, and maybe 3 Elixir would be a heavily toned down Expo, which means that you can use it as a quick defensive card. I think this would be how Clash Royale would integrate it into Clash Royale, because they want new cards to appeal to as many players as possible, not only to keep card releases relevant, but also to boost shop offer sales. The current Expo is such a niche card that it wouldn't make sense for Clash Royale to release it into the game like it is now without some unique twist to make it more versatile. I was initially gonna say that the cannon would probably get the same treatment as an Expo if it was released today, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it just wouldn't make sense. If Clash Royale were to give it the ability to have either double shot at a smaller range or single shot at a further range like it is in Clash of Clans, I think it would be too OP, since the cannon is mainly used to counter melee win conditions in the decks that it's played in, and occasionally counter longer range troops. I think if Clash Royale were to make the cannon double shot, it would have to be more expensive than the normal card version, like maybe 5 Elixir rather than 3 Elixir. So it gives that versatility of providing good value for larger tanks at the cost of extra Elixir. I think the cannon would still be a common card, since in the end, it's still the most basic building in the game. Okay, I'm just gonna jump in before this section starts. I recorded this and edited this section before the 3 Musketeer rework, which is so sad timing, because I probably should have waited just a bit before they released the 3 Musketeers. But now that it's been reworked, it gives an entirely new context to what would happen if an OG card like the 3M was released today. But to be honest, I still think my prediction was okay. So just keep in mind that I make it sound like the old 3 Musketeers is currently in the game. It's kind of interesting to see the parallel between my thinking and the modern dev team's thinking for the 3 Musketeers. I feel like Clash Royale would get flamed for releasing the 3 Musketeers in today's landscape of Clash Royale, since it's a really lazy card design. It is literally a group of 3 of the most basic cards put together in one card. And to make it worse, the fact that it's so expensive means it's kind of a balancing mess. As I talked about in my video of which cards shouldn't get evolutions, this card has been doomed from the start, with it probably only having one time in its entire lifetime that it was even somewhat viable. I think that it just wouldn't be worth Clash Royale's time to make a card like the 3 Musketeers, especially since they probably know that it wouldn't really go well, and it's not really a healthy long-term card. And if they were to release a card that has more than 1 Musketeer, it would probably be like the Spirit Empress, where you can have 2 Musketeers for around 7 Elixir, and the full 3 Musketeers at 9 Elixir, like I talked about in my video of the cards that shouldn't get evolutions. However, it's entirely possible that Clash Royale could innovate with the 3 Musketeers. They could make the card overall different. For example, something like the Rascals, where it's 2 Musketeers and then some troop like a sword-wielding character in front of them. I think this kind of works since it makes a reference to the original 3 Musketeers book, where another character comes along and joins the Musketeers. This would not only make it so that the 3 Musketeers is actually a unique card on release, I actually think it would be better in this way and if it costs 7 or 8 Elixir. I think this one's pretty similar to the 3 Musketeers, where a skeleton army would probably be received by the player base as Clash Royale just running out of ideas, and how it's a boring card concept. However, since there are so many swarm cards in the game, people would probably talk about how it's outshined by cards like the Evolved Skeletons or the Goblin Gang, since they are pretty similar cards. I feel like Clash Royale would make it more similar to the original Scarami, where it's more expensive but has way more skeletons, since having a card with a pretty small number of skeletons released in today's Clash Royale landscape just wouldn't make the Scarami special at all. There isn't really much else to say for this card. I think it wouldn't be a great card release if it was made today, and I think it would have to be released alongside its evolution if it wants a chance to do well in the meta. The reason the Scarami is so popular nowadays is because newer players feel like it's the best defensive card and spell bait, but if it was released 10 years later, it wouldn't make sense for newer players to sub out their trusty Goblin Gang for this card that would basically do the same thing. I think the Skeleton Army would be a rare card rather than an epic card, since it doesn't really align with epic card releases. For instance, it can't be the same rarity as cards like the Rune Giant, the Vine Spell, or the Goblin Curse. Another thing I feel like they could do with the card if they didn't want to make it literally just an army of basic skeletons is to give it some skeleton guards at the front that can tank 2 shots from a Princess Tower, since that would make them more threatening on offense without sacrificing their defensive capabilities. I know this might be controversial, but I honestly think that the modern dev team wouldn't make an Elixir Collector like the one we have currently. I feel like the Elixir Collector is one of the most difficult cards to properly balance, since it can either be the best card in the game or a pretty bad card. It just doesn't align with the fast-paced playstyle of modern day Clash Royale in its current form, and it's honestly a really unique card that needs extremely fine-tuning. Releasing cards that aren't compatible for evolutions doesn't seem like a great move for Clash Royale, since in the end, they want to give out as many evolutions as possible, so it's already an argument against the Elixir Collector being released today. And to make things worse, the team doesn't want to spend a long time balancing a card that wouldn't really be popular in like 99% of decks, since it would only really work in more expensive decks. On top of that, I think the Elixir Collector should be more dependent on the match rather than being a fixed 6 Elixir investment for 8 Elixir, since that would make it more versatile. For example, they would probably make it cost like 5 Elixir, but it would only give back a fraction of Elixir that your enemy plays. plays. This way, it's more matchup dependent, and placing an Elixir collector can mean that you can spam your cards and force Elixir from the opponent that can be collected by the Elixir collector till it reaches its maximum capacity of 7 Elixir. This would be so much better, since it wouldn't mean that a player can stretch to double Elixir to get the most Elixir possible like the strat it is currently with this card. It would actually make it so that if you play an Elixir collector, you have to play other cards to get your reward rather than being rewarded for basically not doing anything. I think this would be deserving of the first legendary building in Clash Royale, since this would be something that we've never seen in a card. And I actually think that this way, it would be a pretty versatile card, since this would actually make sense to use in decks that aren't entirely beatdown oriented. I think if Clash Royale were to release big spells into modern Clash Royale, it would be so different. If they had not even thought about big spells all the way until modern Clash Royale, it would make sense that they would treat big spells rather than big risk, big reward cards as more defensive cards, since it seems clear that Clash Royale doesn't want spells to be used as offensive cards, since for the last like 10 years, they've been nerfing spell crown tower damage. However, I feel like Clash Royale is still going to make modern big spells deal an outrageous amount of crown tower damage just so that it's really strong on release, and then they'll nerf it over time after the shop offers go away, as they've done with the Goblin Stun ability and the Goblin Machine. I think that Lightning would still work in the same way with 3 strikes, but since Clash Royale would want to make it unique, they would probably give it the ability to deal the most damage if the target is in the center, and it would deal less damage the further out you go. This would make the Lightning more skillful, but I feel like it would probably just become obsolete to the Rocket. But it's the only way that I can see Lightning as a modern epic card if it had some kind of twist. I think that the Rocket would just work the same way as it is currently, since this aligns with how modern day rare cards work, but it may probably have a thing where it deals more damage if it's played on your side of the map, rather than the offensive side. Like for instance, a damage multiplier if it's used on defense in order to reward defensive play rather than offensive play. The Wizard is consistently one of the worst cards in the game at the moment, since he's too expensive to really compete with other 5 Elixir splash cards like the Executioner and the Evolved Witch, so it would make sense that a newly released Wizard would cost 4 Elixir. I feel like at 4 Elixir the Wizard would be a pretty good card, and I doubt that many mid-ladder players would be swooping in to release their splash cards in their deck with the Wizard, since leveling it up quickly would be so unrealistic, but over time the 4 Elixir Wizard would probably become pretty popular. I also think that Clash Royale would probably make the Wizard a common card rather than a rare card, since it kind of aligns with recent card releases, where common cards have very simple mechanics, such as the Berserker in early 2025, which is literally just a 2 Elixir high DPS card. In terms of community feedback, I feel like the Wizard would probably have the same sort of reception as the Berserker on release, where it was underwhelming on release, but over time as Clash Royale gives it some more quote-unquote emergency buffs, it would become a pretty popular card, since I think the Wizard would be a really strong card at 4 Elixir. I feel like Clash Royale could combat the mid-ladder problem by making the Wizard a really late unlock, so you can't unlock it early on and overlevel it early, which would make the game overall more balanced. If I'm being honest, I put this one off for a bit, since I struggled so hard to think of what a modern dev team could do with the Witch. I think it's obvious that the Witch would look different if it was released today compared to when it was first released, since the team would not want to go down the same balancing route that they have for the last 10 years with this card. I think the dev team would make the Witch cost the same amount of Elixir, since her ability is well balanced out by her Elixir cost. I just think that they would make it more similar to the Clash of Clans Witch, by making her range similar to a Musketeer. To compensate for this, I think they would also make a mechanic where the Witch stops moving when she's spawning skeletons like in Clash of Clans, where they would probably add an animation of her spawning skeletons to make the card physically stop while spawning skeletons. I still think that she would move at the same speed like she does right now, and have the same health where Lightning perfectly counters her but Fireball doesn't. I think the longer range would make the Witch better at dealing with 1v1s against other cards, since she's further away, which would allow her skeletons to support her better. And I think that to stop this from being too OP, the fact that she would stop moving while spawning skeletons would mean that she's not just insanely powerful with her 6-tile range. Clash Royale would probably still make this card an epic card, since I feel like it belongs in the category of cards that have more than one ability, but these abilities aren't deserving of legendary, such as the Rune Giant and the Void. This one was tricky for me to think about, since the mirror is one of the most fundamentally game-breaking cards in the game. First of all, I think that Clash Royale would avoid releasing a card like the mirror, since it wouldn't really be compatible with evolutions. I think the biggest issue that the current mirror has is that the situations where a +1 version of a specific card is useful is so rare that it just doesn't make sense as a viable strategy, especially since you have to play the mirrored card after you play the normal card. So rather than implementing the mechanic that the current mirror has, I think it would make more sense if Clash Royale were to make it so that you can activate your mirror and mirror any card in your deck, rather than just mirroring the last card that you played. This would give the mirror more opportunity, since it wouldn't mean that you would have to strategically play a certain card so you can mirror it, and you should just be able to mirror a card as long as mirror is in cycle. I think with this kind of mechanic, mirror should work in the exact same way like it is currently, where it costs 1 elixir extra and it mirrors cards 1 level higher. I feel like this way, it would give mirror some extra versatility, because it means that mirror doesn't get stuck in your cycle, and it allows you to mirror cards without having to worry about playing a specific card first, before getting the mirrored version.
Pull this back with the wall breakers. No! I'm not going to play a card though, just in case it makes sense to mirror my wall breakers, which I think it will. I'm going to tank the Ice Wizard as well, because Ice Wizard doesn't do too much damage.
Another thing I thought of while editing is that they could make the mirror exactly like it is now, but mirroring evolved cards counts towards cycling them. Maybe that would make it broken, but it's an idea that aligns with Clash Royale's fixation to make evolutions work. The Hog Rider is the quintessential beginner card in Clash Royale, mostly because of how versatile he is, meaning that he's a good card even in top ladder gameplay. So it's honestly really difficult to accept that Clash Royale wouldn't make a Hog Rider earlier on in the game's lifetime. But keeping this aside, if Clash Royale were to release the Hog Rider into modern Clash Royale, it probably wouldn't be too different to the OG Hog Rider, since it's clear that the OG Hog Rider is inspired from Clash of Clans. So we would still get a building targeting troop that can jump over the river. But in order to give it a unique twist, Clash Royale might slightly change its Clash of Clans version by giving the Hog some health as well as the Rider, making it kind of like a cover, in the same way that the Battle Ram has health and then it turns into 2 barbarians. Basically, when the Rider is killed, the pig can continue to run towards the tower. This was an idea I had for the evolved Hog Rider, but it's not out of the question for this feature to come to the base card. The reason I think this is because every single win condition released in like the last 3 to 4 years has had some special feature. For example, the Suspicious Bush remains invisible until it reaches the tower, and the Rune Giant is basically an Ice Golem with an enchant ability. And finally, the Goblinstein is like an Electro Wizard combined with an Ice Golem with a Chain Link ability. It seems that all new win condition cards in Clash Royale have to have some unique ability that has never been seen in the game before, so I can see how the Hog plus Rider idea works for the base card. If they were to make the Hog Rider just a basic card like it is now, then I think it would make sense that they would release an evolved version of the card alongside its normal release, where it's like the Super Hog Rider from Clash of Clans, where the pig and the rider split up once the rider is defeated, so that at least it's a unique card release. The freeze spell has never really been in a great place in the game, but if I'm being honest, the vine spell is exactly what I would envision a modern day freeze spell to look like. I just think that its animations would be different. The freeze spell should be able to bring troops to the ground, since when we see it in Clashorama, a wizard throws a freeze spell and air troops drop to the ground, and I feel like this just makes sense.
Speed you along, I'm going to throw you a rage spell. Oops, that was a freeze spell, sorry. Let's just discuss this when you've had a chance to thaw.
On top of that, I think Freeze itself should be able to deal damage over time, since that's kind of how Frostbite works. I also think that something that could have been really cool is if the Freeze spell had some sort of damage amplification, since I feel like in real life when you're really cold, you feel a lot more pain. But maybe that's too many mechanics to put onto one card. I think that to keep the Freeze balanced, its duration would have to be a similar length to the Vine spell, and it would probably still be around 3 to 4 Elixir. So basically, the modern day Vine spell is exactly what the Freeze spell would look like if it was released today into Clash Royale. I hope you enjoyed this video though. Thanks for watching.